As insane as this might sound, I've made it a point with my seasonal anime watching to try out every new show that comes out each season. Not just the ones I think I'll like, not just the most anticipated ones, all of them. Granted, this often means I don't even make it through half an episode of the really bad shows, but it also exposes me to dozens and dozens of new ideas that I would never have experienced otherwise. Case in point, during my binge of this year's spring seasonals, I just so happened to try out two extremely CG heavy anime back to back. Both of which start with a cold open and feature a bombastic action scene as the opening set piece. One series I dropped shortly after said action scene was over because it was so horrendous, and the other I got all the way up through episode 7 of before getting bored. Even though I can't really recommend either of these shows, the sheer coincidence of them both doing very similar things but with a wide disparity in quality compelled me to do a deep dive into each of them to show why one works and one doesn't. First up, Black Rock Shooter Dawnfall, an anime you probably haven't thought about since early April because A, it went to Disney Plus jail, and B, it's a load of hot ass. Controversial statement, I know, but I think looking at just how ass it really is a worthwhile endeavor to a certain extent. Now, to be honest, the first few seconds aren't that bad. We get some establishing shots of destroyed military vehicles alongside ruined civilian cars, shortly followed by a newspaper montage explaining how nanomachines started taking over the world, and then capped off with a close-up of a dead soldier for a bit of shock value. Trite and overplayed, but not incompetent yet. That said, things start to fall apart pretty quickly once the actual action begins. The camera rack focuses on a battle going on in the background that kinda looks like it might have some decent choreography from really far away. Unfortunately, said choreography instantly becomes unreadable once we get closer. The framing is way too close for a clear picture of the action, and the speed at which it cuts from shot to shot doesn't allow the eye to fully settle on whatever we're supposed to be focusing on. In the span of about 3 seconds, we cut from a robot running towards the camera, to a reverse shot of said robot flying back towards a different POV, to a giant mechanical fist raised to the sky, and then finally to a wide shot of more action. The last of which I didn't even realize was happening until my third or fourth viewing of this scene in a row, and it's actually kind of amazing just how many bad cinematic decisions caused this confusion. The rapid cutting causes severe disorientation because we're not given enough time to focus on a single shot, and the lack of variety in color design leads to everything just kind of blurring together. Even though the focus of the frame is relatively the same between the raised fist and the wide shot, the scene being so dark and the colors all melding together means that the quick movements of the fist-wielding character are easy to miss as she darts over to the left side of the screen. The cutting briefly slows down to show a line of robot soldiers calmly advancing, but then immediately spazzes out again with a series of nearly illegible close-ups cutting at rapid speed. And the dim lighting combined with liberal use of shaky cam is probably what gave me a headache as I tried to figure out what exactly was happening here. The only shot that's clearly identifiable is when she grabs this robot here, because the robot is the only thing with a color scheme that's visibly distinct from everything around it. More migraine-inducing cuts later, we get this shot of the girl flying through the air looking completely rigid and artificial. No doubt a side effect of ineffective keyframing on this model's path of movement. And this rigidness also pops up in the lack of recoil as she fires from a stationary position, again feeding into the artificiality of it all. We also finally get a scrap of insight as to why this character is even here, as she complains that someone called the Empress hasn't shown up yet. Very little detail, obviously, but I was at least hoping this would be followed up by a bit more to go on. We then cut over to a completely different character speeding out of a tunnel on some kind of motorbike with enemies hot on her tail. The rate of cutting seems to slow down for the moment, but in its place we get one of the most boring and tensionless bullet hell sequences I've ever seen. The frame becomes completely littered with bullet trails to the point where I can't even tell if the girl is actually avoiding them or if they're just not affecting her. She's doing the bare minimum of movement to avoid them, so I guess these robots have even worse aim than bottom barrel stormtroopers. She then follows this up by ejecting blades from the side of her bike that fly into the air, turn into mini jet fighters, target the robots, and then slice them to bits, which would admittedly be a really fucking cool maneuver if not for the fact that the rapid cutting comes back and it all becomes white noise. Like, I couldn't even process that she had this kick-ass weapon because the frame is blasting me with so much information that I can't keep up. By this point, my brain was almost completely fried from how much illegible information has been jammed into just over a minute of screen time. And after more rapid cutting ruining what could have been a really cool sequence of this rotating heavy cannon shredding through robots, the girl calls out for someone over and over, presumably the Empress that the previous character was also waiting for, before falling to the ground after a light grazing of bullets that seemed like the work of a pea shooter compared to the attacks she already fended off. We then get a brief montage of these two characters falling to the robot horde to show the tide of the battle turning. Though this turn is so sudden because of the lack of battle direction that it just feels kind of meaningless. This brings me to the last point that irks me about this opening scene. I have absolutely no clue what the fuck is going on outside of Robot Uprising. I have no idea who these characters are, what their relationship is, why they specifically are the ones fighting the robots, or literally anything about their personalities that I'm not forced to assume based on their voice acting. Even when we finally get to the scene that actually has the titular Blackrock shooter in it, who I presume is the person the other characters are calling out for, I still have absolutely no idea why any of this is happening outside of vague tropey knowledge about Robot Uprising stories. And more importantly, I don't understand why I should care. Now, in fairness, this lack of knowledge about what's happening kinda comes with the territory for flash-forward openings. Since this most likely takes place near the end of the plot, we're not really supposed to know exactly what's happening, but instead be wowed by the spectacle of it all in order to make us want to know. However, as I so laboriously explained, the only thing wowing about this opening sequence is how incredibly awful the cinematography is. And so with no solid story hook and no attractive visuals, this attempt at a cold open action scene falls flatter than Blackrock Shooter herself. By the time it skipped back to its true starting point, I had absolutely zero interest in whatever story it wanted to tell because of the sheer incompetence of its opening scene. Which I probably could have figured out before I even loaded up this episode because I've dropped pretty much everything this director has made, but it never hurts to try. In any case, I was ready to move on to the next series, which turned out to be A Stab Life Great Escape, a series that I actually got a little more than halfway through before falling off because the sheer insanity of its ideas and intensity of its presentation were enough to at least get me to that point. Unlike Blackrock Shooter, A Stab Life doesn't open directly on the action, but instead quietly builds up to it for about a minute and a half. This in and of itself is not an automatic positive improvement. It is possible to open directly on action and still be engaging, but it does display a fundamental difference in how the respective creators approach their work. One dashes out the gate immediately and throws as much flash onto the screen as possible, regardless of how well composed it is, while the other is much more deliberate and methodical in executing action scenes. As I was saying, A Stab Life opens on the end of a rainy funeral observance. After the opening sky shot, we get a close-up on the feet of who we will eventually determine are the main characters, displaying their sci-fi-esque fashion sense. This shot seems to be a method of differentiating them from the crowd of additional mourners in the previous extreme wide shot. Most of the mourners are dressed in black, so the white shoes and leggings of our main characters immediately stand out, thus drawing our attention to them. It's not really that profound or impressive, but at the very least, it signals that this show does have a solid understanding of contrast. When we finally get a clear close-up of the characters' faces, two of them have a mostly neutral yet serious expression, while the third character is openly weeping over the person whom the funeral is for. This contrast within what we'd normally assume to be a contiguous group creates a bit of intrigue, further compounded by the moment when they climb into the hearse and the weeping character suddenly becomes more serious, suggesting that this weeping might have been an act. As they drive off, we get an establishing shot of the world that this story takes place in, one that appears to be made up of enclosed, densely constructed hubs dotting an otherwise sparse and barren landscape, further building intrigue as to what exactly is going on in this story, as does the following shot of them approaching a border checkpoint guarded by robots. At this point, it might seem like I'm just tediously listing off everything that happens in this opening scene. And yes, to a certain extent that is what I'm doing, but the reason I'm doing it is to draw attention to how methodically this opening scene is being structured. It quickly establishes what is happening, who the main characters are, and what kind of world this is with the least amount of details as possible in a manner that doesn't leave the audience completely confused, yet still leaves many questions unanswered for the moment, so as to keep the audience engaged and wondering about the details behind these broader plot points. Why does this character immediately stop being sad once she's out of sight of the other mourners? Why is this world structured like this? Why are they trying to take what we presume to be a corpse past a border checkpoint? Then, just as the dots begin to connect in our heads, the action scene immediately kicks off after hearing a sneeze from inside the casket, conveying the idea that this is actually an attempt to smuggle someone across the border after faking their death. And the action scene shifts into high gear once that realization is made. Admittedly, I do wish they had taken a couple more beats after the sneeze to really let that realization set in, but I can still see the merit in kicking off the action scene instantly. What's important is that we now have a much clearer idea of what's going on and why we should care that these characters are about to execute a bombastic action scene. While this scene isn't quite as intense or high-strung as Black Rock Shooters, it still manages to establish an exciting, yet mildly playful tone and keep that tone consistent through the rest of the scene. The hearse crashes through the checkpoint with robot drones in hot pursuit as the client climbs out of the casket and starts berating the girl in the front seat, who responds in a cheerful, almost ditzy manner. From there we get a brief look at the base personalities of the main characters through both their dialogue and their actions, which allows these characters both to have a concrete chemistry and to establish a connection with the audience through realistic yet lighthearted banter. The tonal transition into the action scene is also greatly aided by the color design, swapping out the drab grays of the funeral segment for brighter and more widely ranging hues. The music also becomes much more thrilling and exciting, with a focus on poppy brass instrumentation to keep the action sequence lively and upbeat. This is probably a good time to talk about the actual animation and CG work. And while it's definitely not on the level of anything made by, say, Studio Orange, it is surprisingly competent, which you should take as a pretty substantial compliment from me since I typically hate anything made by Polygon Pictures. Their work in the mid to late 2010s made me extremely bearish on the concept of full CG anime because I found their character models and art design incredibly ugly, but the past few years have shown that the studio seems to be heading in a much more pleasant direction. As for Estab Life, the character movements are a bit wonky from time to time, but they still have some solid weight behind them, and the designs are detailed enough to be distinctive without going overboard and becoming cluttered. To be honest, there's not a whole lot I want to say about the specifics of this action scene because it's just generally pretty competent, as opposed to Black Rock Shooter fucking something up every 3 seconds. The editing is pretty relaxed and lets the sweeping camera movement carry most of the intensity rather than constantly cutting to different shots, and that camera movement gives the characters enough distance so that the action is clear and readable. This scene also has a bullet hell sequence similar to Black Rock, but there are no bullet trails, so the screen isn't cluttered to hell and back. These robots do still have a bit of that Stormtrooper effect, but it doesn't feel as egregious a fault because these robots are notably smaller, so it's more believable that their bullets might not have as much of an effect. Everything's just pretty competent all around. That said, there is one moment in particular that really stood out to me. After they get out of the hearse to hack a terminal, one of the characters gets distracted by banter and is shot in the head. There's a prolonged slow motion segment just before the impact, creating an immediate sense of tension that temporarily entrances the audience with the idea that this show is about to get extremely dark, further hinted at by a sharp change in musical tone. However, the head explosion that follows is accompanied by a bizarre, upbeat soundbite similar to one you might hear after completing a task in a mobile game, and the character's head explodes into bright blue globules rather than the gory red one might expect. We get a bewildered reaction shot from the client being utterly confused as to what just happened, before returning to the wide shot and seeing that the girl whose head exploded is still alive, complaining that she just lost 5% of her body mass, from which we could probably conclude that she is some sort of slime creature. It's a surprisingly entertaining bout of tension and release, as well as yet another hook drawing the audience into this world so as to learn what exactly is going on in this story. While I eventually ended up dropping both of these shows, I must stress that they were each dropped for entirely different reasons. I dropped Black Rock Shooter after 4 minutes because it was utterly incompetent on almost every conceivable level. I dropped A Stab Life after 7 episodes because I stopped caring about the characters and the scenarios for each episode rapidly decreased in creativity. But that opening sequence still stands out as something that immediately sold me on this show's potential. There is a great deal of value in sorting the mid from the trash, and even more so in trying to find out what makes each show the way it is. Special thanks to Rourke Tenjoin, Chris Adili, Ryan Johnson, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.